Okay, imagine this. You look up one night, maybe back in the 1660s, and there's this bright light moving across the sky, a comet.
Right, a really striking sight.
And people all over Europe saw it. They were talking about it, writing about it.
Yeah, and reacting in such different ways. Some were, scientifically curious, trying to figure out its path.
While others saw it as maybe a sign, a message from God, perhaps.
Exactly. But the key thing is, it got people looking up, thinking about the world around them, questioning things.
And that really ties into what we're discussing today, doesn't it? This whole period often called the scientific revolution.
It does. Roughly, let's say, 1500 to 1700. And there's always debate, wasn't it a sudden revolution or more gradual? But what's clear is that people were asking questions about nature much more, finding new answers, and crucially, developing new ways to find those answers.
Right. So for this deep dive, we're looking into this early modern period. And it sounds like it was this real mix. Old ideas bumping up against new ones.
That's a great way to put it. They didn't just wipe the slate clean. They were definitely building on older knowledge.
Even while sometimes saying, look how new and different we are.
Precisely. And a lot of the groundwork laid back then, the methods, the knowledge, it's still fundamental to science today.
So where should we start? These new ideas didn't just pop out of nowhere, right?
Not at all. You really have to see the early modern period growing out of the Middle Ages, many of the intellectual frameworks, the institutions, even specific questions.
They came from earlier times.
They did. And methods, too. But you're right, the early modern thinkers themselves often, well, they kind of dismiss the medieval period, emphasize their own novelty.
It's funny, isn't it, that sort of looking down on the immediate past while still standing on its shoulders in a way.
It is. And another thing to remember is that change happened unevenly. Italy might have been ahead in medicine or engineering earlier on.
Before places like England caught up.
Right, and different scientific fields moved at different speeds, too. So it wasn't one single bang. It was more like a bustling marketplace of competing ideas, systems, experiments.
Okay, so if it wasn't a totally clean break, what were the key things happening before this period, say in the 1400s, that really set the stage? What changed the game?
Good question. I think we can point to 4 really crucial movements or events from the 15th century that profoundly reshaped the world for people living in the 16th and 17th.
4 big ones. Okay, what's the first?
First, the rise of humanism. Now, we often hear Renaissance and think immediately of art and architecture.
Michelangelo da Vinci. Yeah.
And that's part of it, of course. But humanism was much broader. It involved literature, poetry, history, political thought, theology, even science and medicine.
So way beyond just aesthetics.
Absolutely. The core belief for humanists was that they were starting a new era, a modern age, by looking back and reviving the achievements of ancient Greece and Rome. A renovatio artium et literarum, a renewal of arts and letters.
A renewal based on the past.
Exactly. And interestingly, they're the ones who largely created our common division of history: antiquity, Middle Ages, modernity.
And they weren't too keen on the middle part, were they?
Generally, no. They often saw it as a sort of dark or stagnant time between the glories of Rome and their own exciting new era.
Right. So how did they go about this renewal?
A huge part was recovering and studying classical texts. Think of someone like Poggio Bracciolini. He was a papal secretary, but he spent time hunting through dusty monastic libraries.
Hunting for what?
Lost classical works. He rediscovered crucial texts like Lucretius's On the Nature of Things, which had ancient atomic theories, Vitruvius on architecture and engineering, texts that had often survived in maybe just one fragile copy hidden away for centuries.
Wow, incredible. Like finding hidden treasure that could change how people thought.
It really was. And it wasn't just Latin text. There was a major revival of Greek studies, too. Scholars like Manuel Chrysoloras came from Byzantium to Italy around 1400 teaching Greek.
Which hadn't been widely known in Western Europe for a long time.
For a very long time, yes. His students became leading humanists, desperate to get their hands on Greek manuscripts, even traveling to Constantinople to find them. Plato, scientific texts, literature.
It sounds like a real intellectual ferment. So how did this humanist focus on the classics impact science and technology specifically?
Well, in a few ways. Positively, the rediscovery of texts was key. Think Ptolemy's geography, Archimedes' mechanical works, Vitruvius. These offered new data and models.
Yeah.
Humanists also developed new skills in textual criticism, figuring out the best version of an ancient text. And their interest in Plato, who emphasized mathematics, helped boost the status of maths. It offered an alternative to the Aristotelianism that dominated universities.
Right, challenging the existing framework.
And their admiration for Roman engineering, seeing the ruins, reading Vitruvius, spurred new interest and innovation in architecture and technology, especially in Italy.
Makes sense. You mentioned positive impacts. Was there a downside?
There could be. Because they idealized classical antiquity so much, there was sometimes a tendency to dismiss or overlook the very real advancements made by Arab and medieval scholars, particularly in maths, optics, medicine, and engineering.
Ah, I see. So in looking back, they might have skipped over some more recent progress.
Potentially, yes. Which is ironic, isn't it?
It is a bit. Okay. So humanism is number one. What was the second major change?
The second was the invention, or perhaps the successful deployment, of the printing press with movable type, usually credited to Johannes Gutenberg around 1450.
Ah, Gutenberg. Everyone knows that name. Movable type, that's the key bit.
That's the key. Making individual letters out of metal that could be arranged, inked, and pressed onto paper, it was just vastly faster and more reliable than copying books by hand.
Which must have been incredibly slow and expensive.
Exactly, and prone to errors creeping in with each copy. Printing wasn't instantly cheap, but it dramatically increased the speed and scale of book production.
And there was a demand for books already.
Yes, literacy in universities had been growing in the later Middle Ages, so there was a ready market. And for the humanists, it was a dream, a way to produce accurate, standardized editions of their beloved classical texts.
So more books, faster, more accurate. That had to have a huge impact.
Phenomenal. Printing spread like wildfire across Europe.
Yeah.
Within 50 years, by 1500, presses were operating in hundreds of towns, and they had already printed millions of items.
Millions, wow.
And that explosion continued. Books got cheaper, more accessible, but it wasn't just big books, think pamphlets, newsletters, broadsides. It created a whole new communication environment.
Sort of like the early internet, maybe. A huge leap in information sharing.
That's a good analogy. And crucially, something often overlooked. Printing revolutionized the reproduction of images.
How so?
Well, think about copying a scientific diagram or a map by hand. The accuracy depends entirely on the copyist's skill and understanding. Errors accumulate easily.
Right, details get lost or distorted.
But with printing, you could create a woodcut or an engraving, a master image. Then you could print hundreds, thousands of identical copies. This was transformative for anatomy, botany, cartography, engineering, any field relying on accurate visual information.
That makes total sense. Accurate images are vital for sharing that kind of knowledge.
Yeah.
Okay, so you have humanism reviving old texts, and the printing press spreading them and new ideas like never before. What's number three?
Number three, the great voyages of discovery. This really ramps up in the 15th century. The Portuguese were pushing down the coast of Africa, trying to find a sea route to Asia, bypassing the old Mediterranean trade routes.
To get spices and silks directly.
Exactly. Under figures like Prince Henry the Navigator, they explored further and further south, setting up trading posts, eventually culminating in Vasco da Gama reaching India around Africa in the late 1490s.
And bringing back goods, but also stories, information.
Absolutely. Tales of new lands, peoples, plants, animals flowed back to Europe. Now, it's worth noting this built on some earlier medieval travel.
It wasn't completely out of the blue.
No, figures like Marco Polo or Franciscan and Dominican missionaries had traveled extensively in Asia in the 13th century. So there was some existing knowledge, some foundation.
Okay. So the Portuguese went east, then there's the other direction.
Christopher Columbus, sailing west in 1492. He famously underestimated the Earth's size and overestimated how far Asia extended eastward, partly influenced by humanist rediscoveries like Ptolemy's geography.
He thought he could get to the East Indies quickly by going west.
That was the plan, and let's be clear, the idea that people then thought the Earth was flat is largely a myth. Educated Europeans knew it was a sphere. The debate was about its size and whether ships could actually make it across the vast unknown ocean. Could they carry enough supplies? Was there anything in between?
So when Columbus landed in the Caribbean, he genuinely thought he was near Asia.
Initially, yes. It took a while, and other voyages, for Europeans to fully grasp that this was an entirely separate landmass, a new world.
And how did news of that spread?
Again, the printing press was crucial. Reports and letters circulated quickly. The name America, after Amerigo Vespucci, started appearing on maps relatively soon. around 1507. Governments, like Spain's with its Casa de Contratación, tried to centralize and control the flow of information maps, reports from explorers, samples.
Managing this flood of new data.
A flood is right. Think about it. Entirely new continents filled with unknown plants, animals, minerals, and, of course, peoples with different cultures and societies. It was an information overload.
How did that challenge existing knowledge?
Profoundly. Old classification systems, often based on Aristotle or classical sources, simply couldn't accommodate all this novelty. Botanists, zoologists, they were overwhelmed. And finding people living in all sorts of climates challenged ancient ideas about uninhabitable zones. It forced a major rethinking of the natural world.
And demanded new skills, too, presumably.
Definitely. Navigation, map-making, shipbuilding, understanding resources exploration and exploitation drove demand for new scientific knowledge and technological expertise.
So the world literally got bigger, and the number of things to know about just exploded. Okay, humanism, printing, exploration. What's the fourth big change?
The fourth is the reforms of Christianity, often sparked by Martin Luther posting his 95 Theses in 1517.
Right, the start of the Protestant Reformation.
It began as a protest against indulgences, but quickly grew into a fundamental challenge to the authority and doctrines of the Catholic Church. Factors like the printing press, spreading Luther's ideas, rising nationalism, and the political aims of German princes all fueled its rapid expansion.
Leading to a major split in Western Christianity.
A huge split and subsequent divisions within Protestantism itself, Lutherans, Calvinists, and others. And tragically, centuries of religious conflict, the so-called wars of religion.
How did this religious upheaval interact with the intellectual changes we've discussed?
It's complex. Luther himself wasn't really a classical humanist. He could be quite critical of pagan authors. But the emphasis on reading the Bible directly resonated with the humanist focus on original sources. Others, like Philip Melanchthon, who was a humanist, played a key role in reforming university curricula in Protestant lands. They wanted better editions of Aristotle, yes, but also integrated other subjects and sometimes challenged medieval interpretations. New Protestant universities had space to innovate.
So, reform within education, too. What about the Catholic response?
That's the Counter-Reformation. The Church undertook its own reforms, clarified doctrines, standardized practices, notably through the Council of Trent, held over many sessions in the mid-16th century.
And new religious orders emerged.
Crucially, yes. Especially the Society of Jesus and the Jesuits founded in the 1540s. They became incredibly influential in education and scholarship.
The Jesuits. I know they were known for their schools.
World-renowned, they were often at the cutting edge of pedagogy. While respecting Aristotle, they placed a strong emphasis on mathematics and the sciences. Jesuit colleges were often early adopters of new scientific ideas.
And they were global, weren't they?
Hugely global, thanks to their missionary work coinciding with the voyages of discovery. This created an amazing network for exchanging information, observations, specimens from Asia, the Americas. Their motto, finding God in all things, arguably gave a spiritual impetus to studying the natural world.
So, wow, you take these four huge shifts together. Humanism looking back, printing, spreading knowledge, exploration revealing new worlds, and religious reform reshaping beliefs and institutions. It really paints a picture of a world in massive flux by the 1500s.
That's exactly it. Whether you saw it as a completely fresh start or a revival, people living then, especially educated people, perceived it as an era of profound change, of novelty. It created anxiety, sure, but also immense opportunity. A bustling, sometimes confusing marketplace of ideas, goods, possibilities, truly a time of new worlds opening up.
It really does sound like a pivotal moment. So thinking about this deep dive into the early modern world and the forces that shaped it, the rediscovery of the past, the explosion of printed knowledge, the encounter with new lands and cultures, and the reshaping of religious thought, what surprised you?